This podcast is sponsored by BPIExamPrep.com, the most affordable and effective way to make sure you ace any BPI certification exam. More at BPIExamPrep.com. Enjoy. Welcome to the Building Performance Podcast from Green Dream Group in Chicago. I'm Corbett Lunsford, and today we're talking about trends in high-performance building and retrofits with the legendary Neil Moyer, who is a researcher and trainer with the Florida Solar Energy Center currently, although he has, in the past, first of all, has 30 years experience, has worked with Joe Stiebrook, has worked with the Building America program since the get-go, traveled all over the country, worked in all kind of climate zones. Neil, thank you so much for being on the show.
My pleasure to be here.
So I would like to jump to the chase and ask you, what is wrong with what is happening right now?
In my opinion, I think we're getting too much into the regulation. We need to have a little bit more variability. That's where you can put it into the hands of the builder or the consumer, instead of just always saying that we've got to go with a prescriptive method and then cover it in saying that we're doing performance, because really we're after a building that works and taking the building as a system. And we're getting all these regs and rules without taking that into account, and I'm concerned about it. One of the areas I'm very concerned about, and I'll speak specifically about the hot, humid climate, because that's where I live and that's what I'm concerned about, is the ventilation standard, ASHRAE 62.2. In the north, fairly easy to do using exhaust-only ventilation. In my climate, we can't do that. So we have to dehumidify that outside air, and that costs money. So anytime I go to a national conference and I hear about how great it is to air tighten buildings, and then we just ventilate and it saves money, not so here. That costs us money here. So things like that I get concerned about, that we're not taking the entire building as a systems approach. Mm-hmm. We say we are, but really we're not.
In fact, I believe Dennis Stroer had mentioned on the last time he was on the show that instead of a minimum, ASHRAE 62.2 was named a maximum in Florida. Is that correct?
That's correct. Our code says that's the max.
And so how do you actually implement that in Florida?
Well, there's a lot of different ways you can. The easiest and least expensive way is just bringing outside air to the air handler. The problem is that if I try to meet ASHRAE 62.2, I'm going to have times when I bring in unconditioned air, so I'm going to add humidity. So what a lot of guys are doing is they're doing a runtime ventilation. In other words, they have the duct that goes to the return side, and it only brings in outside air when that air handler operates or when the coil is energized. That's a relatively low cost. It kind of meets ASHRAE 62.2, but not in its entirety. The only way that we can really meet it is I have to have a dedicated system that can bring in outside air, filter it, dehumidify it, and deliver it to the space. But that adds a lot of cost. Mm-hmm. To do the dehumidification system, you're looking at probably a minimum of $1,000 plus the installation. So it does add cost.
That's a lot more than a bath fan.
That's a lot more than a bath fan.
You mentioned the prescriptive that we wrap in a performance kind of wrapping to make it look nice. Can you give us a specific example of what you mean?
Specific. Well, probably the ventilation is one of those, is that we say we want to bring in outside air and for the people, but yet we're offering a prescriptive code. You must meet ASHRAE 62.2. So if in my climate I can show that I don't need to have that much air, why am I being forced to? Why can't I just say, okay, performance-wise, the building doesn't need that much. Why am I being mandated that I must meet that standard?
So you're a believer in more of the art of building science rather than the science of it?
Yes. I think it's a combination. There is a science part, and I believe in the science part. It works everywhere in the nation. But there's also the art part, and it's got to be the combination of the two.
Mm-hmm. How do you train that? Now, you're a HERS rater trainer,
yes.
And in Florida, that's something else entirely, too, which I'd love to hear about. But how do you work in the art, especially in a HERS rater class?
The only way that can really be done is that they have to have a good mentor. And therein is the problem. There just aren't many out there because money is a constraint. I mean, it's wonderful to say I want to mentor somebody, but we also have to make a living as well. And then there's the whole competition part. Do I want to train my competitor so he puts me out of business? So it is an issue. In my particular case, I work for the university, And I'm at a point in my life where I just didn't give it all away. So if anybody wants to pick my brain, like, go ahead. It's
Great.
wide open.
And your cell phone number is?
No.
So as far as the difference between existing homes and new homes, in Florida, is it a big divide between, I mean, classically it's the BPI, HERS rater, new homes, retrofits, they're two totally different things.
Yeah. In Florida, we're relatively new housing. We don't have many old houses, unlike up north. Our housing stock probably goes back to the mid-1900s. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have houses older than that, but because we're in an air conditioning dominated climate, people didn't want to live here. So we just don't have that many buildings. With the advent of air conditioning, now the building started. So our housing stock is relatively new, though that doesn't mean there isn't opportunity for retrofit, because these 1950s, 60s, and 70s houses, there is opportunity for retrofit. They were houses built with no air conditioning, so there's retrofit in that, though many of them have already been done. Also, lack of insulation, so it's how do you insulate those? They're generally low-pitched roofs. How do you get in there and do that kind of stuff? So there is opportunity, though it's not as great as in the Northeast, for example. New construction, the challenge is to work with the builders and architects so they build a good building with the building science in mind and also the building as a systems approach. And then it can work.
What do you see going right in all of the different climate zones?
Probably the biggest thing is that there is an awareness now that the building is a system. When I first started in this industry, that was an unheard of concept. We would mention it, but we really didn't know what it meant. And now there's been enough of conferences gone on and enough training going on that the building as a system is catching on. We still haven't grasped everything because we still have our independent areas of expertise. And so when I think building as a system and I'm an air conditioning contractor or heating contractor, I think about that. And then, there's this system around it. Or if I'm an insulation contractor, I think insulation. And, there's this other stuff around it. But at least we're heading in the right direction. So I think that's the biggest thing I see is the building as a system.
What was it like when you started doing this and it wasn't an industry? And some people argue that it's still not really an industry. And that's maybe a conversation for another day. But what was it like in the old days of, you're just making this up? I mean, they'd invent the test tools and then say, learn how to use this.
Well, in fact, I was fortunate in that I was one of the guys that helped develop some of the test tools and work with guys that did and some of the test procedures. And we would go in to houses that had failures. I mean, that's really where I kind of got started, was houses that were in failure and bring them out. Again, mainly in the hot, humid climate. That's where I did most of my work, though I have worked all over the nation. And you go in where you had licensed contractors who have been doing this, the second, third generation, and they look at you like you're crazy. I'm qualified. I know what I'm doing. This new stuff, get out of here, kid. You don't know what you're doing. And so,
were you a kid? How old were you?
Oh, back then, I was in my 30s, early 30s. So I wasn't a kid, but this is my fourth career choice, I guess. And so part of the process was the show and tell. When we do a test process, I had to be able to show that what I was doing was really what was going on. And so that's like, for example, the duct testing, the pressure pan, the smoke in the ducts, all that was part of that.
Do you find that made you a better building scientist than people nowadays, and myself included, came in, and we were talking about this a few minutes ago, took a 5-day class, took an exam, signed up with a provider, and all of a sudden I'm a building scientist, which I didn't feel that way. And I think most people who go through that experience are completely lost and looking for a mentor. Yeah. Did that, having to prove yourself at every moment as opposed to being sought after by someone who needs you, did that make a different professional? Yeah,
I think so. I mean, it's much like being a trainer. A trainer must know a lot more than what he's going to teach. And so in this aspect, I had to understand how moisture moved through buildings, how air moved through buildings, what was going on, why was this doing this, and to be able to prove it not just in one way, but in a couple different ways, because I was trying to prove to myself that I was right. And so if I talked about, air movement through an assembly or through a wall cavity, I didn't have just one way to show it. I would have 2 or 3 ways of showing it. So yeah, I think it was different then.
Do you have any favorite buildings that you worked on or projects?
Favorite buildings.
Or least favorite?
Probably the one that's one of the most memorable, which didn't turn out the best, unfortunately, was here in Central Florida, retrofitting a house that had indoor air quality problems. In fact, they were both sick. And it was a crawl space house, had moisture problems. It was an older house built probably in the 50s, 60s, had some retrofit done on it. It had a metal duct system in the crawl space, and it had and the air handler was also in the crawl space. And so it was pulling a lot of this wet, moist air in, and they were sick. They had mold problems, so it was that whole sinus issue thing. And in fact, the wife had already had a number of sinus operations because of that. So to go in there as a consultant and say, okay, here's what's going on. I know how to fix it, but unfortunately, I don't know that you can ever live in the house, because there is also a psychological aspect. And because they happen to be in the medical profession, they had understanding of that. But they said, well, we want to try it, so let's go ahead. So wrote up a whole scope of work, what needed to be done. And it was quite intensive, because we had to deal with that whole crawl space, the moisture issue, the duct system. In fact, we tore that all out, put in new.
In the crawl space
in
still?
The crawl space still. And in my job was that of a consultant. I don't do the work. I just say, here's what needs to be done, so I remain third party. And so they hired money was not an issue to them. They hired supposedly the best of each of these various industries. And when I come back in to do a test out, the duct system was extremely leaky. And so it was a case of an argument with the crew, and they said I didn't know what I was talking about. And then the owner of the company coming in and telling me all of his credentials and how great he was. And I said, well, it doesn't meet my standard. I'm not going to pass it. And, if you can convince the owners that you've done a good job over what I say, then, that's up to them. And I showed them with smoke where the problems was. It still had some issues. And they saw it and said that they weren't going to fix it. And unfortunately, they had to end up selling the house. They couldn't live in it. It wasn't done well enough for them to live in it.
Isn't that kind of the sadness of being a consultant? Is that you're like Cupid trying to make 2 other people fall in love with each other, but sometimes it just doesn't work out a lot of the time.
It is, and that's one of the reasons I have a hard time dealing with some of the IAQ stuff, is because I know if they've already been sensitized to it, it's going to be hard to make this house work, or this building work. In the case, and I've done both residential, commercial, and it's similar in both of them. It's hard, and it has to. When people have already been sensitized to it, you have to take it to the next level. It has to be done above and beyond what would be a normal building. So it does make it hard.
So many of our listeners know what it's like to be on a building project site, or for single families or commercial. What is it like to be involved in the Building America program, where you're literally making up the building science rules as you go? Like, this is how we're going to build the wall. And I'm sure that there's 3 other people on the team who say, absolutely not. You're absolutely out of your mind.
Well, and you're right. There's a lot of that back and forth as to what will work, what won't work. So with Building America, it was always, let's build a test house first. Let's try it. Kick it around. Where does it work? Where doesn't it work? Not only from the selection of materials and the assembly of those materials, but also for maybe the contractor. Maybe it's a new technique. For example, I was involved in the first unvented attics. And what we did there is we went out to Las Vegas, where we wouldn't have to deal with a moisture issue. But there was another problem in that doing an unvented attic with batted insulation, which is what we did first, was extremely labor intensive. Well, there aren't the crews that can do that. So they would try to do it really fast, and we wouldn't get the quality, so it wouldn't work. So there was a lot of issues like that in getting not only the process you want, but also getting the crews that can do the job correctly. Because it is, if you're going to do a high performance, it means that everything has to be done pretty much perfect. And that's a challenge.
What do you see coming, now that you've been through 30 years of this industry developing, what do you see coming 5, 10, 20 years down the line?
I see probably a lot more of the controls, new materials, more forgiving materials, because we are getting smarter in that arena. More so also in the building as a system, and we are getting more into understanding how buildings work. I also get excited in watching the next generation come up, and them, when they get it, the light bulbs going on, and I know that they'll take it to the next level. I mean, I kind of help pick up the football, but these guys are going to make the home runs, or the field goals, whatever you do in football. I'm not a sports fan. You figured that out by now. Football, that's the funny ball, right?
Yeah, that's the funny shape.
Yeah. So I'm excited about that because I am seeing the industry grow. When I first started, there was like this big ocean liner just headed full steam ahead for the iceberg. And now I see it turning a little bit. And for me, that's exciting. Like I say, the area that I am concerned about is all the codes and regulations. It's adding, I think, some belts and straps on us that we don't really need. But that's just my opinion. I don't know.
Neil, thank you very much for being on the program.
My pleasure.
Neil Moyer is a researcher and trainer currently with the Florida Solar Energy Center. You've been listening to the Building Performance Workshop. I'm Corbett Lunsford. Tune in next time.